This conference
Jackson,
will now be recorded.
Jamie Atten, A-T-E-N, Eaton, I'm sorry, thank you. Joel Blanchette, Kenneth Mason, Richard Wassersug, and Sylvester Mann.
Is that man with friends?
I'm sorry?
How do you spell man?
M-A-N-N.
Okay.
And I stand corrected on Jamie's
Double
last
N.
name. A-T-E-N is the correct spelling.
Okay. The one thing that I will do is if someone joins us, we'll stop and catch them up on what's going on since the call is normally not recorded.
Sounds good.
So Howard was discussing active surveillance, and some of the men that he knows or has dealt with that are on active surveillance using terms he doesn't necessarily agree with in their situation.
And I know, yeah, the one, first off is using the word survivor. I mean, the typical man on active surveillance may have had some psychological trauma, but he, and they're all he's, other than those who are Ken's transgenders, and that's a whole other topic. He typically has had the most severe thing that's happened to him has been that he's had a biopsy, or if you get claustrophobic like I do, an MRI. And so, it felt to me like calling somebody like us a survivor is melodramatic, an overstatement, or as Rick Davis would say, over the top. And so, as a journalist, I know that there's a tendency on the part of the media to refer to people who have cancer, almost automatically as a survivor, as a hero, as a warrior. And actually, I find all of those words irritating, but that's me. And I noticed in the article, about being a stage 4 cancer, that the headline said survivor. Then, I saw in the body of the story, and I'm blocking on your name now. Is it Jamie or is it
Jamie?
Oh, okay. I mean, well, in the body of the story in the Philadelphia Inquirer, the author refers to himself as a survivor, and I just wonder, how anybody else feels about the word survivor. Are you comfortable with it? You think it's too much? Not everybody at once.
Well, I see Mr. Jackson has a thought going through his head, but he's deferring to who else might want to say. So, Rich, why don't you have something on your mind? Why don't you speak to it? I think you're muted.
Survivor is a term that I would use for someone that was in World War II in a concentration camp. And a survivor is someone that's in a situation where they should have died, they should die, or they should be dead. And for whatever reason, they came out the other side and made it through whatever situation they were in. What immediately comes to mind is a soccer team on an airplane flight in the Andes many years ago. Right. Those guys were survivors. Mm-hmm. They should all be dead. They weren't. Mm-hmm. I simply have a group of cells in my body that are in open rebellion. I mentioned, it was mentioned to me during my initial treatment for the radiation that, oh, you're a survivor. I said, I was a survivor last year. It says, no, you weren't. You weren't diagnosed. Bullshit. I didn't wake up one morning and the cancer was there. It's been there a while, which means I was a survivor before it was official. So that's why, to me, the term, in my case, doesn't apply. Sylvester, what do you think?
I think living is a survival. I've gone through some problems of my own, and while they were not catastrophes, maybe deep down I might have wished they had been. But just living from day to day, in my opinion, is a challenge. And just surviving daily challenges. The word survivor, perfectly okay with me. I think it depends on the interpreter who's listening and who's reading the articles to decide if they are reading about survivors or simply reading about challenges. For me, either term is perfectly okay.
And Sylvester, what kind of cancer do you have, and how advanced is it? What kind of treatment have you undergone?
In 1999, I was diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer. At that time, I had a prostatectomy. 6.5 years later, my PSA began to rise. At that time, I had external beam radiation. And since that time, my PSA has remained at 0.01. And I see my urologist once per year regarding my prostate cancer.
And so where are you from, LA? I think I met you.
I'm from Atlanta, Georgia, but I've been to Los Angeles to several of the prostate conferences.
So you've been through a lot. And you sort of view yourself as a survivor or not?
I don't really think I'm a survivor. I do understand that my cancer was aggressive, but I understand there are other people with far more aggressive cancers than I have. So I really don't consider myself as a survivor. Maybe if my cancer recur and I get over that recurrence, maybe I would at that time consider myself as a survivor.
Now, Jamie, in your article, you referred to yourself as a survivor, and the headline writer called you a survivor. In some ways, you're a survivor of sort of mistakes.
What? I apologize. It cut out there at the last thing that you said. What was the last part that you said?
Yeah, it struck me, Jamie, that you may be a survivor, but a different kind of survivor. You survived the system, or you survived the treatment process or the diagnostic process, but you didn't have the disease that they thought you had, right?
No, actually, I was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer at 35.
And so can you remind me and the rest of the group, what did you do about it? Did you treat it?
Yes, I did. And, the title on, the calling myself a survivor, that was changed by the publication. So my original title that I had written was when it comes to battling cancer. Sorry, my office got those automatic lights that just went out. When it comes to battling cancer, remember that you're more than a statistic, was the way I had originally titled my article. But at 35, was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. Ended up doing oral chemo twice a day, radiation 5 days a week, and went through that for around 3 or 4 months. Took a brief period to rest, and then had a major surgery that removed a significant part of the colon. So I have a permanent colonoscopy now, or colostomy. And then just after I started finally healing some from the colostomy surgery and the removing of a lot of the colon, and then it had spread from the colon to a mass on in my pelvis on a nerve bundle. So they removed the mass that had the other cancer, and then all the lymph nodes and everything, and then ended up doing another 6 months of drip chemo after that. So it was a year total of treatments before I then had my testing done again. And at that point, they had found no evidence of disease at that point. But I agree that word survivor can be challenging. So one of the other things is I also have survived going through Hurricane Katrina. So I had moved there just 6 days before Katrina struck. So move into the community, Katrina hits. And one of the things that going through cancer, though, that I found very different was Katrina moved over my community in Mississippi in the matter of hours. And as soon as that storm passed, everybody that was still alive was considered a survivor. And for me, one of the big differences was like when I was going through treatment, I never considered myself a survivor. Because I felt like in many ways it was like having a Katrina-like storm hovering over me for over a year. And even though my scans have come back, that storm, if you think about it, right, like a major, and I studied, hurricanes and things. So a major disaster hits and it moves on. But for us, it sets on top of us, sometimes for a year, sometimes for years, sometimes it never goes away and just keeps hovering. So, it's been kind of this, I would have never thought I might use this word survivor until after I had found out that I had no evidence of disease, but it can still be challenging because I know that I'm at high risk for it to come back.
In the body of your story, you do refer to yourself as a survivor. You've been through a hell of a lot. Are you comfortable with that word survivor?
I am now, but it for me is what is happening in the day, that I don't, I'm aware that this could come back for me. And so at this point, I do view myself as a survivor. But, with it, one of the things I like about that language, like, so for instance, I do a lot of trauma therapy, with people that have gone through, like just recently I responded to the Aurora mass shooting that happened not far from where I live. And then I'm getting ready to head to Alaska to help disaster survivors that are dealing with some of the trauma after the earthquakes. And then my team just got back from Africa working with refugees. And one of the things I do like about Survivor is that it has more emphasis on empowerment versus victim. And so I do think the words that we use to describe ourselves are important, but I don't know that survivor is always the best term. For me, one of the things that I struggled with too, and I don't know if you guys did, but I had a lot of people that when I was going through my treatments, and typically when I felt the weakest, is when people would tell me that I was resilient. And I've spent 14 years studying resilience, and the definition of resilience, kind of a lay definition, is like taking a beach ball and putting it underwater and it to be able to bounce back. And there was no bouncing back. I was practically deflated, barely hanging on through my year of treatment. And then it took me probably close to a year before I got anywhere near where I was physically before I started treatments.
When they said, can I ask you, when you said that they said you were resilient, they were observing you, was that to make themselves feel better?
I'm not sure. In some cases it might have been. In other cases, I think it was people trying to provide encouragement to me, because there were times that I felt really down about feeling like, that I couldn't do the things that I used to do. And I had to rethink things. Like for me, I started thinking of napping as active rest, right? So like at first when I would have to nap all the time, I hated it because I'm like, I can't even stay awake to play with my kids. And one day I was like, no, I'm active resting. Like I turned it around. And then it helped me feel better with that process. But one of the things that I've ended up later discovering and reading a lot about recently, and we actually developed a research scale on it, is around the language of fortitude. Because fortitude is about enduring and enduring long suffering and metabolizing the suffering that we go through. And so for me, endurance and fortitude have been more meaningful words to me. So for instance, I lost 3 of my friends that work at the college also from stage 4 colon cancer after my diagnosis. And their bodies never allowed them the opportunity to physically bounce back. But to me, they were resilient, but their bodies didn't allow them to bounce back. And so to me, fortitude or endurance have become key words that I've really latched on to give myself meaning about my experience.
So I want
that's something else they do with the language of
Howard. Hold on a minute, Howard, and we'll get to you, and we'll get to the language. But I want to talk more about just survivorship here. I love that term, active rest. I love it, Jamie. And the reason why is because several of us on this call can relate to it, having been on long-term hormone therapy for a good period of time, where we exist with no testosterone in our bodies. I fortunately am off it because it was successful, but there are other people on this call who are still on it, and who have in written publications referred to themselves as eunuchs, because technically that is the case. And I know that when I was deep into the hormone therapy, about 18 months in, and I knew that my job was to, if nothing else, to exercise every day, because that was critically important, and it wiped me out. I would come home and I would sleep for 45 minutes or an hour. And that is exactly what active rest is, that you take a nap because you need to take a nap, because that's part of what you do. And I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that term going forward. I'm going to tell people that they need to do some active rest. It's sort of like active surveillance, which is what raised all this issue. I'd like to ask Ken, because you've been on active surveillance for your prostate cancer and your bladder cancer for a long time. You'll tell us how many years momentarily. But Ken, how do you feel about that word, survivor? Are you a survivor?
It's difficult for me to answer that. I have had the ability in the years that I've been going through this to actually meet people who, for one reason or another, didn't consider how do I explain this? It was as if, because I was doing active surveillance, I really didn't have cancer. And that was very disturbing for me. I mean, I went through the tests, I went through the biopsies, they found stuff, they took pictures of it, they did more biopsies rated as cancer, low grade, but it was still cancer. And then within a matter of years, going back to the NIH and following through with the clinical study, they couldn't find lesions that were originally there. They did biopsies, and all the material came back cancer-free. My personal complaint when I first joined this community and these support groups was I did not particularly care for the fact that if you survived 5 years after treatment, doctors considered you cured. And to my way of thinking, a cure isn't for 5 years. A cure does not have an expiration date. A cure is forever. The way I came gradually about dealing with people who would say, oh, you know, prostate cancer, that's the kind of cancer to have because it's treatable. Oh, low-grade, you know, prostate cancer, active surveillance, that really isn't. Was eventually, it came into my mind that for people to diminish that cancer is not our responsibility, and it's not our misguided duty to pass along opinions and comments like that. As you brought up, you know, if you want to play a technical game, they found the bladder cancer. I was treated for that. I went back for tests, and in a CT scan, they found growth in my kidney, and I had kidney cancer, and I had a portion of my kidney removed, and have been all clear. So as you are wont at times, Rick, to point out, you know, I can be poster boy for different types of cancer, but
yeah, I mean, I would say, Ken, that you have every good reason to call yourself a survivor because you've been through 3 different cancers. Now, thank God, none of them have been, they've all been treatable. But we don't know where it's going to pop up again. And to me, that is a testimony to survivorship, that you are, to go back to Jamie's word resilient, that is resilient. That's the ball popping up to the water and then going under again and then coming back up to the top and then going under again. By the way, I posted a link to Jamie's article in the chat window if anybody would like to look at it. I also posted an article to a link to one of Howard's articles and to 2 of Richard Wassersuch's articles, which all deal with these issues. Cure, that is a really great language of cancer word, cure. It comes up very often, and we are well aware in certain communities, certain cancer communities, that the cure is not feasible. Durable remission is feasible, and we can talk about durable remission as a euphemism maybe for cure. But I know in my own case, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, T3A. I can never consider cure. Every year when I go for my test, which is all I do now, the cancer could come back. So, yeah, how do people feel about that word cure?
Before we get away from Survivor, Richard had posted in the chat window that the very broad definition of Survivor is the official language of the American Cancer Society. Well, Howard's on the phone, so he can't see what's in the chat window. But
Right, I appreciate you reading it.
But Richard did agree with me.
To Rick Davis's point about the cure, that's kind of a media-loaded word too, along with breakthrough. That it's widely used. The public, has its hopes built up. Charities try to collect money. They're promising cures and breakthroughs, and in my opinion, it's kind of an overused word, overpromised. That's my.
I mean, Jamie, can you, I don't know enough about colon cancer to know whether you are comfortably able to refer to cure, or do you have to think of yourself as if you're in durable remission?
I don't feel comfortable using the word cure for myself, just because I do feel like I could still be at high risk for it coming back. Just looking, that was one of the things I kind of talked about in the article, of struggling with the statistics of somebody that uses statistics on a daily basis. And when I use those to inform the types of ways that I help after disasters or help people that are going through traumas. And so I take those things very serious. And so when I look at the statistics about survival rates for somebody who's been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, I don't feel like I can use the word cure. I'm hopeful, but I don't use the word cure. And, just as I think about our conversation about Survivor, I see that one like there's a little bit more room for subjectivity. To me, cure is really more of a medical way of talking about things. So like, for instance, as a psychologist, I might say that somebody's depressed, and as a Cubs fan my whole life, most of my life, I would say I'm depressed. But as a Cubs fan versus as a psychologist or healthcare provider, the word depression takes on two very different things, right? There's a different ways of talking about it. So when we start getting into cure and remission, those sorts of things, to me, I feel like our professionals in the healthcare system need to really have a more clear language, kind of like what Howard was saying about what does that actually mean, so that we're not giving false hope and we're giving accuracy with it. But then when I think about survivorship, I see that one, just like listening to each of us share some of our stories and our reactions to it. My thinking would be that each of those are valid for each of us. And so if that's a term that's going to help you, or if it's one that hinders you, then we should have the right to be able to tell others, this is how I want you to talk about me, or this is the language I find helpful. But oftentimes I felt like most of my experience, I've had to accept the labels of others, whatever it was. And I think it's important that we who are going through and have been diagnosed with cancer, that we have the freedom to let others around us know what type of language we need to hear from them. Because I do think our words to each other and the words that we use to ourselves really do matter.
Jamie, in your article and when you first started discussing your diagnosis, you said you had issues saying stage 4.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a particular reason that you couldn't make that stretch, or that you didn't want to accept it? Or
Yeah. I mean, I think you said it right there. Was I didn't want to accept it, and the other part was, for me, it really, it was like getting that diagnosis and hearing stage 4 to me felt like a death sentence. And I remember thinking, like, how am I going to go through all of these treatments, especially like, for instance, after when I had the cancer surgery to remove the cancer, I was bedridden for about a month, and I had never experienced, people talk about pain and suffering. In that moment after my surgery, I realized that was the first time in my life I'd actually experienced suffering, right? Like pain, I hurt something, but I know that it's going to go away, and I feel like that pain will go away. But after that surgery, I had hurt for so long that I couldn't remember what it was like not to hurt, and wondering, is this what my life is always going to be like? And realized that there was a difference between pain and suffering. And then it was so overwhelming. I remember thinking, I can't keep going forward if I don't feel like I have hope. And for me, it was hard to have hope early on here in stage 4, because as a researcher, as soon as I got my diagnosis, I remember my wife and I, and at the time, so I have 3 young daughters as well, so they were really young, which made that even harder for me. That because I remember thinking, if it's stage 4, and I started looking at the statistics and the odds of me being around for when my girls grew up, they weren't in my favor. And so for me, stage 4 represented that I might not be there for my daughters. And that was really hard to think about, how am I going to fight through this? So much of me just wanted to give up.
But you said that your job and researching helped quite a bit as far as being able to deal with it and address it. How did you help yourself?
Well, so one of the things that as I was going through this, a big turning point for me was, I had gone through my initial round of oral chemo and radiation. I'd had my major surgery, and I remember going back for a checkup and thinking I was going to find out that we were going to set up an appointment for another scan to see if my treatments had been successful. And it was in that appointment that my doctor says, we did a review, and I took it to I don't remember what they called it, but you know how they have like that group of like multidisciplinary folks, and they staff our cases to all these doctors and experts,
Tumor
and
board.
What was that? Yes, exactly. Wow, I've not heard that term for a little while. The tumor board, that was it. And when instead of finding out I was getting a scan, my doctor told me we're recommending that you do 6 more months of drip chemotherapy. And I was so beaten down from my surgery and the previous treatments, I really didn't think that I could go through that. And remember telling my doctor, like, if you want me to do this, you need to give me evidence that this is going to help me. Because, and I shared with him, hey, I've read some other studies about, because I'm so young, that I could potentially end up developing additional problems down the road of doing this additional treatment. So am I wanting to set myself up for something even more difficult down the road? And so I said, I want to see some research on this. And his nurse later that day sent me a link to just like a generic website that says like chemotherapy is helpful. Like there wasn't much behind it. And so I immediately called back and I was like, hey, I just published a book on evidence-based psychotherapies. So like, I want to see from you actual clinical trial outcome research studies, or even better, I want a meta-analysis study, or I'm not going to let you give me additional chemotherapy. And it was much more helpful to me at that point when I felt like I could kind of stand. That was the first time I really played an active role in my treatment. Up until then, everything was largely just happening to me, and I was going along with whatever. And I did decide to go ahead and go through the chemo, and I did decide to follow, what my doctor had wanted to see happen. But I was an active participant. We looked through the research together, and then I felt comfortable to make that decision. And then as a result of that, he told me I was a bit of a pain in the, you can fill that one in later, because I was always asking for actual research studies before he changed anything on me. And then so he started making me bring in research studies on psychosocial coping with cancer. So, he would share something with me, and then I had to share research on the psychology of coping. And so it actually became, this kind of good relationship between us of going back and forth. So that's how it helped me, was to do that. And then the other part was, as I looked at some things, like I had this one day, so I'm a person of faith. And during the cancer, I was really struggling and having spiritual struggles as well. And there was one day I was praying, and in the Chicagoland, it's really cold, and how that chemo, when you're on it, that you get the neuropathy, or if you breathe in cold air, it feels like you're gargling, glass or something. And I had been outside for just a few minutes trying to help my wife take the trash out, and I got this big gust of air, and it just felt like I was gargling glass. And I had been praying, and then I remember thinking, like, I don't know if there's even a God. And then I paused for a moment, and I thought, well, regardless, the research shows that praying helps people's coping and helps reduce depression among cancer survivors. So I'm at least going to pray for that reason, if nothing else. So research, there was times that I could think about it, of what would help me with my own coping.
Where were you treated?
Jamie, this is
Jamie,
Mason.
hold on a second, Ken. Where were you
Go ahead,
treated,
Rich.
Jamie?
At the time, it was Central DuPage Hospital over in Warrenville, Illinois, at the Cancer Center. Now it's the Northwestern Cancer Center.
Go ahead, Ken.
Okay, Jamie, I was just wondering, as part of your job, it sounds like, and I might not be explaining this correctly, so bear with me, but it sounds like part of your job, it's common for you to move people to accepting the reality, or how best to cope with their situation.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, very much so. That, trying to help people to, so like, for instance, a lot of my work focuses on, like, just for today, like, for example, I also, I founded and direct the Humanitarian Disaster Institute. And then a year ago, we launched a master's program in humanitarian and disaster leadership. So just today, actually, I was teaching a group of graduate students in a course on disaster trauma and crisis intervention. And one of the things that we were looking at is, I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering what you found difficult to accept. I mean, this sounds almost like a little bit of a case of physician heal thyself, not of the disease, but of some of the doubts and some of the lack of a better word, mindset that you had, your discomfort with being able to even say the word stage 4. But one thing earlier too, just as an added note, we often call what you did with your doctors as finding your voice. And it's a common phenomenon of dealing with a lot of cancer patients. Most people are used to going to the doctor. The doctor tells them, well, we're going to do this. But you come in sometimes with cancer, and the doctor says, well, what do you want to do about it? Mm-hmm. And, that's always struck me as being ridiculous. But yeah, I apologize. I hope I made it clear. I was just wondering how you dealt with this, with the information that you have, with the classes you were educated with, because you're used to telling people how to deal with situations like this, and yet you had to tell yourself, and but it sounds as if you didn't listen to some of your own good advice. Would that be applicable or correct?
Yeah, definitely. There were definitely times about that where I did struggle with those issues. Like, for instance, very early on, it had only probably been, maybe a month or 2 months into treatment. And actually the president of the college, so I teach at Wheaton College, that's where our institute is at, here in the Chicago area. And our college president one day stopped by my house to check on me and my family, to see how I was doing. And he was asking, like, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything that you need help with? Are you struggling with anything? And I told him that one of the hardest things for me was to go from being the helper to the helpee. That I was used to being the person when a disaster hit. Like, I remember when Hurricane Gustav was threatening our community, I drove my wife and daughters toward up north a little ways, dropped them off with family, and then I headed back into the disaster zone to get ready to help with some of the psychological response. And I remember thinking, like, what am I doing? All the other cars are going north, and I'm intentionally driving back to the what is wrong with me? So, that's a big part of my identity. And then suddenly to be the person that, like, I couldn't drive anymore because I was so weak. And I remember arguing with some friends about, they were wanting to set up car rides for all my radiation. And I'm like, I don't need, any car rides. And then I tripped and fell into the wall. I was like, okay, I need to be a little more humble here. But yeah, that initially on was really hard for me to kind of give up what I saw has been a big part of my identity as a helper. But then realizing over time that I was still able to help others, but it just kind of like that napping versus active resting. Like, I still could help in different ways, and learned that what I thought was weaknesses at times in myself, or that were wounds that I wanted to keep others away from, that instead I could actually let people in through those, and instead of putting up walls, use them as doors to actually have a deeper relationship with people. So in many ways, cancer for me kind of took the way that I understood a lot of the things that I had been teaching and studying others and turned them upside down, in many ways for myself.
So do you look at hurricanes differently now?
Sounds like it gave you a new sense of reality.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. I definitely think so.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Howard, did you say something?
Okay, sorry.
No, it's no problem. I'm just wondering that, having gone through the cancer experience, if you look at the experience that people have going through hurricane or natural disaster, what are the similarities and what are the differences?
I think some of the similarities is that, both of those can be life-threatening and incredibly stressful. But quite oftentimes, it kind of goes back to like what I shared earlier, that, like if a hurricane strikes, the disaster itself, the event of where, your life is in the most danger, may be anywhere from hours to days. But with cancer, that's something that can hover over us for the rest of our lives. And so I think that can add an additional distress, so like with Katrina, you had the potential of being able to evacuate. But with us, with the cancer, it's happening inside. So actually, I just published a book a while back, and the title of it was A Walking Disaster, because the disaster was happening in me. I couldn't get away from it. And then like another difference, and now, so like one of the, now, so then I think a positive that we have as cancer survivors sometimes is the communities around us, because like when a mass disaster hits, typically it breaks up our communities to some extent, that you lose the ability to call someone, cell phones are down for weeks, or people that was your best friend picked up and moved and went somewhere else. And so your social support system gets more scattered. Whereas with cancer, I felt more supported because my system was still here. Yet there was those similarities because I also had people that I thought were going to be there for me that they scattered in the same way that somebody else relocated after a disaster, and I never heard from them again, because being around me made them too anxious.
Yeah, if I could ask you something
Jamie?
else.
Jamie, go ahead, Howard.
Okay. Jamie, early on, you were talking about fortitude. And I think that fits in with the language of cancer as well. Again, a media thing that I think is kind of bad, personally, is almost automatically people with cancer are called heroes. You're a hero just because you have a disease. Some people may be heroic, but I wonder how does that fit in with your research on fortitude? Are we heroes?
So heroes is a term that, again, for some people, I think that may be a very useful. Sorry, I'm getting used to the system here, and I just saw something pop up. Sorry, I got distracted there. So, for some people, I think heroes can be a very helpful term, but I think we also have to be careful that for some people, if they don't feel like they are a hero, then that I think can be harmful if it's not congruent for that individual. Right. So like in the same way I struggled when people would say the word resilient, it actually made me feel worse rather than stronger at the time. And I think, again, like the word hero, depending where a person's at, if that's a language that they're comfortable with and is useful for them, then by all means use it. But I do think we have to be careful not to force just one word or one term, and that we need to have a more nuanced way with all of these issues to have conversations. So like, for instance, even though there was a period when the word resilience was hard for me to hear, I'm still a fan of resilience, right? Like I am still doing research on it. I'm still trying to help communities. I mean, just today I published an article on how to create community resilience with Psychology Today. But that's not the only term. That's not the only way of going through a trauma. And I think with cancer, hero's not the only way. Survivor's not the only way. We need to have these other words and other language to talk through these issues. So I pretty much gave you an answer without giving you an answer.
Oh, and one last thing, too, you mentioned earlier about victims, how survivor may be a better word than victim. And I would say that's another kind of media thing. Look at this poor cancer victim. They call people with cancer victims. They call them heroes. I mean, what are we? One of the big things that I've learned, I think, is, it's sort of self-defining. I've had my arguments with this one guy, and he just automatically calls everybody a survivor, although in the case of active surveillance, we really haven't been through anything. He also calls everybody, all the spouses and partners, caregivers. In fact, a lot of the partners and spouses are against active surveillance. But maybe you could talk a little bit about victimhood.
Well, before we talk about victim, I want to make a couple of comments, and I also want to get Joel Blanchette involved, because I do have a question for you, but I just want to make a couple of quick comments. The first is that a lot of the work that we do as in providing support and navigating people with cancer, any cancer, is to convince them that they are their best advocate and do that as early as possible. And so the interaction that you had, Jamie, with your doctor doesn't surprise me at all, because going in, you don't necessarily feel comfortable enough to advocate for yourself. And what we do more so on the technical call than here is to give those who join us on our calls the confidence and the information that they can advocate for themselves, and that they can ask, why am I doing this? And they can make sure that if they go through a test, there's going to be a positive action emerging from that test. They're not just going through a test for a test's sake, which unfortunately sometimes happens. The other comment that I wanted to make, and we can come back to any of these, the other comment that I wanted to make is that I really endorse your observation that when we use the language of cancer, we should be able to describe ourselves in the way that makes us, as the person suffering the cancer, feel most comfortable. And so if some people want to call themselves survivors, that's fine. If they want to call themselves warriors or fighters, that's fine. If other people don't want to call themselves that, then that's okay too. And we should not be making general rules for everybody. We should do what works best for us, because that is what's going to bolster our own self-esteem, our own immune system, and generally make us feel healthy all around. And that's, I think, an important aspect. Joel, you lead a support group. What are the issues around the language of cancer that come up a lot in your support group?
As far as the support group is concerned, I don't think we've ever discussed it. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't like the word survivor at all. I don't figure I'm a survivor at all. I don't think I'll survive prostate cancer until I die of something else. Then you can call me a survivor of prostate cancer. Also, we're fighting a losing battle, all of us, because according to Dr. Moyad, and this is a quote from Dr. Moyad at the September PCRI conference, life is a terminal disease. So we're fighting a losing battle all the way. So to be considered a survivor, I don't see it. I just don't like the term.
And what about terms in your group like cure or like caregiver? I mean, caregiver is an interesting one for me, because we have a moderator in our brain tumor group who objects to that term greatly, and she prefers the term care partner, which I think is a very nice term, except that it isn't appropriate for everybody, because sometimes you're taking care of people and you're not their partner. But I get what she's saying when she prefers to use care partner instead of caregiver. What about terms like cure and caregiver? And do you talk about cure in your support group?
I think it's come up oftentimes, and I don't think any of our patients in the group would consider themselves cured ever of prostate cancer. I think maybe Dr. Snuffy Myers' adherence to his durable remission quote, and also that you never really get rid of prostate cancer. You might not show any signs of it, but you still have it in your body. So I think, and that may be my influence on the group also, I don't think anybody who is in our group would ever consider themselves cured.
Thank you. Thank you.
What
Thank you.
What is this group about? Who is it aimed at?
Oh, you're talking about Joel's group. What is Joel's group?
It's an us two. It's an us two group. One of the over 200 groups in the country. It's based in Sterling, Virginia.
I gotcha. So it's a broad group. It's not any particular kind of prostate cancer. It's everybody.
Yes, from active surveillance to very advanced prostate cancer, correct.
Gotcha.
You know, I was just thinking about this conversation about the words that we use. You know, one of the things as I was listening to you all just talk right then, like the term, like for instance, this evening, the term durable remission has been mentioned several times. You know, so for me, from the time I was diagnosed to today's date has been almost a 6-year period. And that's the first time I've ever heard that language. I've never heard the term durable remission until tonight. And I want you to know, I appreciate that because, like, for instance, people would ask me, so like, how are you doing? Are you in remission? And I would say, I like to think of myself in a hopeful way that yes, but it could come back. But then my doctors always quickly correct me and say it's no evidence of disease. You know, and hearing this, even this helps me understand there's a spectrum and a way of understanding my experience. And to be honest with you all, I'm really grateful to have been a part of this call this evening, because I kind of went from, like, once I found out and like was able to stop my treatments as best as I could, I had to find a new normal. But then I disconnected from the cancer community. And in fact, it was a friend of mine just recently going into March, who's been involved in a lot of colon cancer advocacy work, said, Jamie, you need to be a part of the community. And so she encouraged me to post. Did you guys see those strong arm selfies that's going around for colon cancer?
No, I have not.
So there's a group doing it where, you like take a picture of yourself flexing or whatever. And I did one because it helps raise money for colon cancer awareness. And then all of a sudden, because I'd used that hashtag on Twitter, there was like all of this feedback and conversation that I'm following now of people talking about colon cancer. And it was like, oh my gosh, I've been going through this. I've been struggling in survivorship. There's all these things that I've not had words for. And suddenly people are giving me the language where it's the first time I have felt normal since being diagnosed, because I finally had a language to understand myself. And even talking to you fellows tonight, like, it's the first time I've got some different perspectives of language of being like, oh my gosh, it's like a light bulb with the words that you're using that I've been lacking to capture. So I think as we talk about those things that, we don't need just one term, we need multiple terms, because we are going to identify with things differently.
So I'm going to throw a challenge out for you, Jamie, and it may not be for you because you have a heck of a lot on your plate, but we would love to have a colon cancer virtual support group that meets on a regular basis, specifically about colon cancer. And I think it would be very, very helpful. In order for us to do that, we have to have a couple of moderators, and we have to have a following, whether it's a social media following, whether it's from Inspire, but we have to be able to get the word out. So over time, and this isn't anything immediate, it could take a year, it could take 18 months, it could take 2 years, but over time, please keep your eye out for prospective moderators who might be interested in creating a virtual colon cancer group that we would be delighted to host here on ANCAN.
Yeah, most definitely. I'd be glad to keep an eye out for that and consider it. Could you actually send me an email about that?
I will, with pleasure, but I don't have your email address. I only have your Twitter address.
Sure. So it's Jamie, Jamie.
Yeah.
Aten.
Yeah.
At Wheaton, WHEATON.
Yeah.
.com.
Got it. I actually know Wheaton College from when I was in my first year at University of Chicago grad school, and I had a sort of girlfriend who was at Wheaton College at the time. So I remember Wheaton College from a long, long time ago. I wonder what happened to Lex. I even remember her name. I don't remember her last name, but I do remember it was Lex. Maybe somebody will hear this and say, "Oh, we know who that was." But anyway, Mr. Jackson,
What is this?
come on in
What is
and talk to us.
Right now, everybody
Say
seems
something.
to be doing well. We're discussing lots of different terms, and the one thing that is a running theme underneath all of it is that everybody has their own term. There is no one term. There's no politically correct term. I think I was writing back and forth with Professor Richard today on a couple of different subjects, and the battle terminology came up. And it's like, I'm not in a battle, because in a battle, somebody wins, somebody loses. And as has been pointed out, living is a terminal disease by itself. So that means we're going to lose. And by definition, since we lost, the cancer wins. So screw battle definitions. And at a certain level with Jamie, you were basically following instructions. And every single person on this call has done the same thing. I wasn't fighting. I was taking off my clothes, putting on a gown so people could look up the crack, because there wasn't a back in it, walk down the hall, hop on the table, and bark if they wanted it. So there, that's not exactly a fighting stance. But what we've determined is that you have to ask the person you're talking to, what do they want to hear? Or if you say something, watch and see what the reaction is. If they flinch a little bit when you say survivor, then ask them if there's a better term. Or if someone uses a term with you that you don't like, that doesn't apply, gently correct them. Try not to beat them too much about the head and shoulders. They frown on those things. But let them know that, no, I'm not a survivor. No, I'm not fighting a battle. No, I'm not in the middle of a war. I will try to live my life the best that I can for as long as I can. And when it's done, I'll call it a day.
Well said by the dog, too.
Again,
Rich, one of the things that I hear you talking about is that you are investing in another individual and asking them to treat you with the same respect, instead of just calling them a hero, a survivor, a one-size-fits-all. If that's the way they want to go, more power to them. But I really appreciate people who you go up to and you say, how are you doing? And if they say, do you really want to know? I like to say, yes, I really do. And that's, I think, part of the issue that we're kind of addressing. We want to be personally involved. We want to be connected. We want to be invested in each other. But because it takes two people, it can be difficult, because we have to get permission from both people. So hope that makes
it's a little
sense.
bit of a dance.
But I appreciate what you said.
Can I mention one thing? With
Sure.
I was a newspaper reporter for 27 years, one of the big Chicago newspapers, and I covered healthcare. And I would say starting in the 1980s, especially dealing with AIDS, we would hear from activists who says, it would be typical for us to call people we were writing about AIDS patients. And so, or epilepsy patients or prostate cancer patients. And, all these groups would come to us and say, we're not defined by our disease. I'm a person with AIDS or I'm a person with prostate cancer. But, as a newspaper person, you're trying to economize on the language, especially in headlines. So, I've heard some complaints here about the headline writing, and it's really a problem if you're going to say, a person with, with prostate cancer. It's too many words. But, and not everybody in your audience is going to agree that, with the terminology that you use, you consider yourself a survivor. I consider myself a person with prostate cancer. So, I mean, it's a struggle for people who deal with words every day. So, is there anybody smart out there that can offer a suggestion? Because we can't ask everybody. I mean, do you all mind being called colon cancer patients or prostate cancer patients? Does that bother you?
It bothers me, and I'm sensitive to that issue, and so prefer to use the phrase people living with whatever the condition is. I don't like the word disease either. I prefer to use the word condition. And when I wouldn't say I'm in the public eye, but I'm somewhat in the public eye because I have to write a fair amount that other people read. And so I'm sensitive to the words that I use. And yes, patient is a word I try to avoid, and disease is a word that I try to avoid.
So you're also an advocate. And so as a reporter, I would hear from advocates of people with various conditions. But, somebody who probably writes news releases and material for websites, I mean, how do you get around this problem in a headline? When you can say in 2 or 3 words that you're asking us to say in 5 or 10 words.
I get around it with a lot of thought. I'm not being facetious. I try and figure out how to précis what I want to say and come out with a very terse phrase that doesn't use words that bother me. And they may not bother other people, but if they bother me, that's enough of a criteria. I don't have a better answer than that for you, Howard.
Yeah, I think over and over again, Jamie and Rich and others have made the point, to try to individualize. And so as a reporter, I suppose one approach would be to say to people, do you prefer that I refer to you as a person with living with prostate cancer? Although to me, that's an extra word in there, living, that's implied. So I might not want to do that. But at any rate, I found this very useful. So I really appreciate everybody speaking up.
Well, just one of the things that this kind of reminded me of as I was hearing you summarize. So earlier today, I was working, we're getting ready to launch a new research study. And one of the things that we do with all of our studies is we collect demographic background on the people that we're doing research with. Or for instance, when I used to do therapy in private practice several years ago, before I would start working with someone, I would want to do an in-depth background history on who that person, how they view themselves. And, if you think about like when you filled out those surveys, like it'll give your age, and typically it gives age ranges that you choose from or an other. Or when it's talking about our race or ethnicity, there's some general categories, but then there's oftentimes an other category. When we talk about income levels, what does it mean to be middle class? Well, there's some general ways of talking about it, but then I still give my participants the opportunity to define how they view themselves from an economic level. And so I think we need a bit more of that to say that we could summarize. I mean, just the people on this call, I mean, you can't say that there's just one word that captures all of our experiences. And at the end of the day, even if we've gone through the same thing on the outward of how it would look, I still can never fully know what it's like to be in your shoes. And you can't fully 100% know what it's like to be in my shoes. That there's going to be those differences. So I think it is helpful, so just like I said earlier, and, so I wrote down that term, the durable remission. Like as soon as we get off this call, by the way, I'm going to be spending like an hour reading everything I can on that, because that's really, I've never heard that. But now it's like, there's cure, there's no evidence of disease, there's durable remission, there's the old generic remission. Like we need those nuances. And in the same way about survivorship or however we view ourselves, we need words because it helps us understand what we're going through. But then we always need that other category. We have to have that other category for people to say, no, I don't fit those. This is how I define myself.
So I think when you do a little bit of that research, what you'll find is that we've sort of abbreviated that term. The full term is durable and continuing remission. I tend to use just durable remission, and we credit it to a doctor whose name was mentioned early on, Dr. Snuffy Myers, who is a genitourinary medical oncologist who retired a couple of years ago and had sort of a cult following to some extent. He was an interesting guy with different opinions and attitudes, but don't be surprised if Snuffy Myers' name comes up. We're about to close, and I'll turn it over to Rich to do that. But Jamie, you mentioned just before that you're taking paddling steps back into the water as far as the cancer community is concerned. I would really like to connect you to one of our moderators. You can read more about him on our website, who is remarkable. And I just think the two of you would have a great connection. He's also an academic. He's a philosophy professor in Indianapolis. And he's a 3-year, and I am going to use the term here because I feel it is really appropriate for him. He's a 3-year survivor of brain cancer, glioblastoma. He has small kids, as you do. And he's very active in the cancer community, especially in the brain tumor community. And I think that the two of you would feed off each other, and I think he would be a great person of support. I think he is also a person of faith as well, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to make that introduction, if that's okay by you.
Didn't say no.
No, I think you're muted right now, Jamie. There you go. You're not muted.
I'll eventually get this. I'm I'm more of a high touch and low tech kind of guy. Earlier, I had to call my wife because I let my youngest daughter, who's 9, work on my computer, and I couldn't figure out how to sign back into my own email and not into her school email. So this is a big step for me to have been on this call. But yes, please do make that introduction. And I did notice that I just discovered it looked like somebody had sent me a message, and I apologize, I didn't see it earlier, about humor. So they had just okay, so it had just said would be great to hear you talk about the use of humor in making things right-sized.
Yeah.
So I won't go on because I know we're wrapping up, but just, to me, humor has been really important. That I know oftentimes it's actually caught people off guard, but I think that's a helpful tool for dealing with some of the struggles that we go through. And even Rich, when you were joking about your crack up in the air, like, I loved that because it's like, I know what that feels like. And you know what? You can't just go to Starbucks and be like, hey, do you remember that time your crack was in the air? Like, right? But that kind of gallow humor, like I wanted to make a joke about having the BB stuck in my crack. When they were doing the staging, like, that's a bond that people have that you just can't talk to other people. Oh, and by the way, please don't put that beside my name.
Oh, that's the best quote of the night.
I forgot there for a moment. That part, let's not go with that one.
And everything will.
That. So yeah, I wanted to validate. Yeah, I think humor is important.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Jackson.
Well, it's, as Rick pointed out, typically we run for about 90 minutes or so. We were hoping for a couple more folks, but I think we had a lively crowd with a good discussion. The key thing I saw this evening was we're dealing with two separate issues as far as language goes. We're dealing with language on an individual basis, with one-to-one, one-to-two, face-to-face, and we're trying to deal with the language of cancer using mass media, where it's one-to-many and the many's blind. So it's a more of a challenge. As Howard pointed out, he's trying to minimize the word usage, the word count, where in an open conversation, we're not so picky about those things. So there's no right answer. On a case-by-case basis, it's easy to, watch someone's reaction, read their eyes, pick up the flinch whenever you say a word, and then you can inquire further. But when, Rick, like you said, when you're trying to write it, you have to run through the list of what's not offensive to me. And then those are the words that you choose to put on paper. For the majority of the people reading the article, they understand that it's one way. Ken, I will mute your ass in a heartbeat. But
I was just politely disagreeing.
I can tell. Howard, you really need to get a good computer or something that you can connect in. I understand Chromebooks not GoToMeeting friendly, but you miss a lot when you can't watch these guys.
I think I'm better off for it. I know some of these.
No.
No, it could
No.
be.
And
Absolutely not.
But anyway, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I came away learning more than I had when I arrived. I hope everyone else sort of falls in the same category. And we do this slightly differently every third Thursday of the month at 8 p.m. Eastern. Generally, this is the last time that I'm aware of it'll be recorded, so we can relax and let our hair back down next time.
I think they did pretty good anyway.
But anyway, does anyone have any closing thoughts for the evening?
No, I just want to say we will post this on the website, on our ANCAM website under recordings and decks. I can't tell you where it will get posted in the new one, or it'll probably get posted on the Speaking Freely page on the new website, which looks terrific and hopefully will get launched by the end of the month. Howard, I will send you a link to the place on YouTube, on our ANCAN YouTube channel. So that you can find it there directly. And I just want to thank everybody for being gracious enough to allowing us to record this. I just think it's been an exceptionally useful conversation for everybody, and I'm very grateful for Rich's moderation and for everybody's participation.
Yeah, very good session, gentlemen.
Here, here. Ditto.
Same time, same
Thanks,
place.
Jamie.
Third Tuesday of next month, 8 p.m. Eastern.
Okay.
Come back to
Thank
visit.
you.
Good night,
Thanks a lot.
everybody.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
all.
Thank you, Jamie.
Good night.
Okay. Night, Sylvester.
Good night, everybody.
Night.